here with the presentation, okay? And if you have already seen or have enjoyed the eclipse, just make a comment here. I'd like to know that I'm not the only one. Really, I'm really into astronomy and the eclipse and everything else. It's fascinating to me. Okay, some people said, oh, shoot, you're in New Jersey. Well, I'm here actually in Washington, D.C. I can feel the light outside changing. I know soon it'll be over Ohio, but I can feel it's the sky starting to change here. So, kind of exciting for me. Okay, let's connect into today's topic. We'll be discussing the idea of violence, abuse in the deaf community. And there's research. Generally, that means, academic research. You know what that means. So I'll talk through that today, see what research, what pros and cons, thoughts, and diving into it, etc. The reason I'm so interested in this topic is that, let me introduce myself to you. My name is Tara. My last name is Holcomb. I'm with Deaf Hope. I've been with Deaf Hope now for 6 years. Last year, I left my full-time employment with Deaf Hope and started my PhD program here at Gallaudet University, focusing on clinical psychology. Because I'd like to get into trauma-informed care, services, support, advocacy, community healing, etc. with domestic violence, sexual violence, child abuse. That's really my area of interest. So up to this point for this last year, I've really been into a lot of research here regarding how do we do it, what sort of research is out there. There's so many things connected to IPV, DV, SA, and deaf that I never knew existed. I never read about. And it's not in my work per se. So for me, I have some disconnect between the academic community and research and that information, and then the people who are actually the front line working in this field every day. There's a disconnect. So I'd like to take this opportunity to talk about that, talk about the research out there, and how we feel, what we need more of, what we might need less of, and go from there. As we move through here, I'll ask some questions of you and love to have your chat comments. I can read those comments here in the chat box. You can also hold your question till next week when we actually have our group discussion, or make some notes for, kind of self food for thought, if you will. If anything's not clear, you have a question, a follow-up, please feel free to type in the comment box. I'll be checking that frequently. All right, let's go ahead and get started here. IPV, what's that? Well, that's a good question. IPV is another term. Typically, it's used for domestic violence. And domestic violence is DV. IPV it's short for intimate, partner, is the P is partner, and V is violence. Intimate partner violence. Domestic violence often is a broad category, including children, families, grandparents, etc. IPV focuses directly on partners. Romantic relationships between partners. That's IPV. Sometimes people will start to focus on that word IPV in the research. I've seen that more and more than in the community. So, again, any questions, please feel free to type your questions in the box. Let's go ahead and begin. Okay. I'd like to discuss why is this important? Why is this information important? Research, the science studies, why is this important? Well, I know intrinsically, but now I have more knowledge that confirms it, that the scientific studies are not all equal. Some studies have lots of mistakes, different approaches, how they use it, how the research is conducted, and they're finding these facts. Are these facts real? Some studies are more as they get into the research, as method approaches, it's more appropriate, but are those facts as well? Some studies help the community, some hurt the community. Because again, research, many people envision the idea of this, it's just neutral position. I'm just here getting data, but that's actually not true. There's really no such thing as neutrality. Even as a researcher, I bring who I am, my beliefs, my identity, my community, and I have that as my bias. I've got my supports that I'm bringing into my research, and that does affect it. And that's not a wrong thing. It's just important for us to realize that, some statistics or numbers that happen to be found This is true. If you drink a glass of wine, it's going to help you, reduce any sort of, cardiac issues. Well, how much wine? How little wine? You got to look in the data more than just that one statement. So again, that's just an important thing to think about. Secondly, I'm wondering a question for you. With your organizations or your community, are you involved with research? If not, why not? Research, including in your community, do they check in with you or do they not check in with you? Are they just looking for participants and they kind of ignore the community work that's happening, or is there a partnership that's occurring? The answers vary, of course, but I'm just wondering about your specific experiences. Have you actually experienced participation in any research before? Feel free to share your comments in the chat box or just think about it. If you have not, would you want to? Deaf Hope has been involved in some research, and personally I have as well. And I'll discuss more on that later regarding our work. The third thing to think about is, how can research benefit us? What sorts of information do we want? What type of information would help us in writing a grant or getting funding or raising awareness, interacting and making connections with the community? What sort of information is needed? Those are the three key questions to keep in the back of your mind as you move through this, as we go through this whole topic. But one thing, before we get started, talking about a bunch of different studies and thoughts and different research, a warning to you and to myself. It's easy to get, really just dive deep into statistics. I want to give you a forewarning here. Stats, you can say, do you know that 90% of all deaf people say they hate hearing people? It's true, 90%. I asked 10 people. And in that group, I hate hearing people club. 9 out of 10 of them said that. And I put this out as fact, that 90% of all deaf people hate hearing people. Statistics do that. You modify and play with the numbers. I'm learning how to do this right now. It's interesting, but is it truth? And again, what is the truth? What is truth? You've got this whole big picture, and I can pick elements out of the picture and say, this is truth. I've yet to share the incomplete picture with you, though. So again, I'm always trying to I'm trying to be careful. I catch myself when I look at stats going, wow, this is great new information. I'm like, wow, this is interesting. Or no, this isn't true. I'm like, you know what? Hold on. Grab the whole picture. There's some pretty funny illustrations I'll share with you in a little bit here. So interesting, that, oh wow, statistics verify that teen pregnancy is on the downcline after the age of 25. Huh. Well, obviously 25 and older, under 20, above 20, you're not a teen anymore. But that's how you lay that sentence out, like, wow, this is brand new information. Well, it's not really. It's kind of it's playing with words. And we can definitely play with statistics in the same way. You got those two people here saying, oh, do you know that 50% of people are bored by stats? Well, 50% is one of them, 1 out of 2. So again, that's really the emphasis here is, and I find myself saying, prior to this, in my work with Deaf Hope and domestic violence, sexual assault, I would throw out these numbers. Here's all these great statistics I've seen. You see a flyer, a brochure, information regarding the statistic, saying this, that, or the other, and where did the stat come from? I don't know. I have no idea where it came from. So now I'm starting to do that research on, where did that stat come from? Why is the stat there? How was it done? Is there good information from this? Occasionally, statistics, are they worse? No, but they can get things better. Again, only 15 or 20% experience that. Well, maybe it's a lot higher because people aren't comfortable exposing themselves or sharing. Or the idea is maybe the wrong population. Maybe the research has a research bias and they're preferring a certain group. So I'll ask my friends and not the general population group. Again, going forward here as we talk through this in various studies, I want you to keep this in the back of your mind. As I throw out these numbers and stats to you, what's behind the statistic? What's going on there? There's a lot that happens behind that stat. Here's one example. I saw this statistic, repeated over and over again, and I've actually used this statistic quite a bit myself. I went into my PhD program, and my very first thing I said, hey, this is an interesting stat. I think it's a great, my professor had a great advisor and challenged me saying, do you think that's true? I said, well, of course. Look at it. It says so. It's published. It says it right here. And they said, okay, you're asking me, do you think that is true? Is that too much? Is that too small? How about in your 5 years of work at Deaf Hope, any experiences? What are your thoughts? So I stepped back and said, I admit I was a little bit caught off guard. Well, I guess that could be too low. 54 could be too low. And I thought many survivors come to me. Many open up. A lot of them talk about, childhood sexual abuse. At the same time, maybe it's too high. Many, would actually share. Is that too low? Because not many don't share. I don't know. So I get to look into this number. I looked into this study more. Is this study good? Is it valid? How did you get that information? The other interesting thing here regarding deaf boys is higher than deaf girls. The research shows wow, what a difference between hearing populations. Hearing girls are higher than hearing boys usually. Now this is the opposite. So we talk through this. So here's the next slide. Here's my question as I think through this. Where did the research happen? Who was involved in the research? Who was the researcher? Who are the people that were polled? Deaf, hard of hearing. Who are they? What? They said they experienced sexual abuse. Molestation. Is that all types of molestation? What types? Does that include, words? Touching? Does that include, full penetration? What does that look like? Also, how was the research conducted? Was it just ask the child? Or did they look at the police report? Was it interviews of the teachers? How did that research occur? They got 54% of deaf boys and 50% of deaf girls. How? So let me explain. Are we good so far? Everyone okay? Great. Well, the answer is this was conducted back in 1987. Okay. There's a published article regarding sexual abuse of deaf youth. It was at one deaf school. We don't know where because of privacy reasons, so it didn't state where, but it's at a school for the deaf. Who? Freshman high school, 9th grade students, 150 students to be exact. How did you get that information? So basically out of 150, 54% of the boys and 50% of the girls said yes, they experienced sexual abuse. So is that through police interviews? So as I looked into this, and I had another person who also, looked into this as well and studied this, it's still not quite clear on how that researcher got that information. Did the students consent and agree or not? Did the parents have to sign a consent form? Did the school agree to this? How about the police and the researcher? Was the researcher with the police? Again, it's still not clear. So I'm a little bit disjointed, when I look at that statistic now. I thought it's a critical stat. The how, the what, the who are they? Let's say there's one person that was a predator at that particular school that molested all of them. There's a higher percentage. Or was this actually based on, their own life previous experience? Meaning that, deaf people have a higher rate. Or would this particular deaf school have a history of something? Or did it happen just to one person? Again, it's not clear to me. There are other statistics that help paint a better, bigger picture. But this is a stat I never knew. That, the 50 and 54%, I've used this over and over again. I use this in a grant application. Now, this statistic here, this other one's new to me. This is the same study that stated that those of who said, yes, I've been abused, via the police interview, 20 to 25% of them both experience at school and at home. Wow. That means when we look at the other 20 to 25%, it's school only. Maybe there is a predator at that school. Or maybe that school has a culture of something. Or, there's something going on there. It's another thing I didn't mention here. Who actually, is it student to student? Or is it staff to student? What are we looking at here? Is that important information to all of you? Again, I can see pros and cons to both. Because any sort of sexual assault is wrong, of course, period. But I want to, as we look at stats for child abuse, is it adult to child or is it child to child? Should there be a divide? Should there not be a divide? Again, as we look into this, we'll see that. But again, let's back up. It's both school and at home. That tells me that, wow, there's a large and serious issue, not just at deaf schools, not just at this deaf school, but also at home too. So again, this is an important one to add to this. It's a big lesson for me. In my first few weeks of my PhD program, I looked at this. So again, this is connected to CSA. Next, I was wondering, in what I'm doing here, I was doing a Google search, and I was doing some research for this particular presentation. So I was working on this presentation. I decided to do a Google search of just people at large, really including anyone. People who work in this field. We don't, do academic publication research every day. We don't. So I went ahead and I want to say, what do we see? What pops up? One of the very first things that came up was the National Domestic Violence Hotline. So I'll give you time to read the screen here. Oh, I apologize. So the chat box is unfortunately over the quote, so let me move it out of the way here. It states that deaf and hard of hearing individuals are 1.5 times more likely to be victims of relationship violence, including sexual harassment, sexual assault, psychological abuse, and physical abuse in their lifetime. It makes sense. For me, I'm like, yeah, this makes sense. Is that information helpful to you? Is that information something that you could use in your work? Here's another one. So Domestic Shelters, a website for general information regarding shelters and domestic violence shelters. They did a database that shows sign language is the third most common language provided by shelters in the U.S. behind English and Spanish. However, it is only available at 5.3% of the shelters. I look at that number, I'm like, wow. I'm wondering, does that mean that people and staff that work at shelters sign, or does that mean that only 5.3% will provide interpreters? Which is a stating. Honestly, I don't know the answer to that. One person messaged me saying, a lot of things are not documented. All these things are just not documented. They're not reported, unreported things. So that's why when we see statistics, this may be underreported. It's very common and related to sensitive private issues. Many people, be very open to, aren't open as strange researchers. Maybe they're hearing, maybe it's a man, maybe it's another culture, maybe it's somebody that's not, from my community. Will you actually share information? Not always. How can we make sure that research is real and connects back to the community and most information is gathered? One thought to share for all of you. Another question here is, we have this statistic. Sign language is only available. Well, there's really two stats here. The first one says the third most commonly used language. Okay, well, that makes sense. That sounds about right. There needs to be language access. And then secondly, only available at 5.3%. I thought, wow. I mean, the 5.3% can sign as fingerspelling count or poor signing interpreter services. Is it only 5.3% provide interpreter services? Well, that means we have a lot of advocacy work to do. And so that explains, all the work that we need to do on a daily basis working with shelters. Could we use this information, as we do a federal government grant, OVW? Could this be used there? Again, I never saw this stat before I did this Google search. Interesting. In regards to deaf, I searched for deaf statistics on domestic violence sexual assault. And this is the information including Deaf Hope. We typically are not crazy about stats because, as I explained, why? Statistics do not always tell the full picture and the full story. But this is a nice picture, kind of the 1 in 2, 1 in 6. Deaf women, deaf men will experience domestic violence in their lifetime. Very powerful, great visual. I don't know anything behind it, where the information came from. Again, I think it came from the RIT, NTID in Rochester, New York. They did a study. I believe it's from there. But again, there's no citation on where it's from. 1 in 2 and 1 in 6. The who, the which, is it a diverse group? Is it one population of deaf people? Is it one community? Is it US wide? Is it worldwide? Again, we just don't know. So it's very powerful to throw a statistic out, making people jump. But, sometimes we use statistics for that purpose. Oh, hold on, my chat box was up. Okay. 1 second. All right. So, after, really quickly here, do a Google search. When I was done, I decided to kind of shift my focus to the research from an academic community, published studies and research from, the last 10 years. That original CSA that was published was from 1987. Again, still critical information, but I want more current statistics. Or research, what's available in this last 10 years, what's been shared. So I want to ask all of you, as we discuss this with my research group, have you seen this before, or is this new information to you? I'm wondering. For me, a lot of this was new information. I had not seen it. Okay? The first one has research connected to services provided in the deaf community. There's research on us, pretty much. It's on our work. Okay. First of all, this talks about domestic violence services for the deaf community. There was a survey done. So I mean they surveyed 195 deaf, hard of hearing college students. 135 were women and 60 were men. Most were white, 54%, 26% were black, 9% were Latino, 7% were other, and 3 Asian. That's the polling group. The question was asked is, do you know about domestic violence services? When you see domestic violence services, who are they? Here, I should make this full here. Hold on. Okay, here we go. What's the impact of the various, on the additional disabilities? So, the results, again, from this particular population group of these college students. 75% knew somebody who experienced domestic violence. 40% said they know more than 3 people. I think that's, again, that's pretty strong in our community, and this confirms that. Again, within college students as well. College students, maybe have a family, parents, friends that have experienced this. Again, we don't know. Interesting. Of those who were asked, were glad to say, I will, I know where to go. But this part wasn't clear. I know to get help. My friends who's experienced domestic violence does not get help. 80% did not receive any help. Meaning that so many people say, it's underreported, it's underdocumented. So many people, aren't coming in traditional agencies for services. Why? I think that's a great thing to ask ourselves. 90% stated it's critical that deaf and hard of hearing staff can sign and sign well. This survey was to, again, college students at Gallaudet University. So that's obviously very inclusive in this community, most likely signing. So this preferring someone deaf who can sign, of course. These top services the students wanted to see were counseling services, was number one, 78%. Secondly, was interesting, was self-defense classes, and then legal services, and then shelter housing. Concerns, and the biggest one was confidentiality. We're a very small community, so that's no surprise. And then personal safety. Again, no surprise. So there's research on what college students think about our services. There's another research study. This one's entitled, What Can We Learn? Examining Intimate Partner Violence Service Provisions in the Deaf Community. Most recently, it was a question regarding college students, what they think of services in general. Do they know people that have experienced domestic violence? Have they received help? What services do you want? Again, very broad in that group of people. This one is an interview with deaf IPV service providers, people like us. Interesting. 11 were deaf and 1 was hearing. Many of us IPV advocates, that's not all we do. There's a lot of other labels that are connected. There's mental health services, social work services, and a whole variety of other work. There's many hats being worn. IPV services is one of those many jobs. So I'm wondering if many of us have that similar sort of role, not just IBP DVSA. That's not your only job. I'm wondering about that. All but 3 provide services to perps, meaning the person who actually harmed somebody, who did the violence. So there's services to both sides. That's very, very different than many hearing traditional domestic violence agencies. They won't provide service to perps, whereas deaf people, they're wearing many, many hats to provide those services as well. And many of us talk about these services, as an ongoing. It's not that way. It changes, and the reason is it's funding. This is a quote. I'll have you read it from a participant. This quote is from Where Should It Be? What is your agency? How do you define abuse? How do you do that? That's the question. This is the answer. I've never really sat down and discussed this because, our agency does not focus on this. It's survivor abuse. We've never sat down and discussed what is abuse, ever. And we provide services. Really, that makes me think, wow, our work is important in advocating and providing resources to agencies. Maybe not just, with those in just domestic violence services, but that still happens. But there's survivors. They still are going there for services. Different service agencies, resource centers, and the like. Many people don't know anything about abuse. IPV, domestic violence, power control, the power control wheel, etc. But, they still provide services. That can be hurtful, without realizing it. People may be overwhelmed, overworked, providing these services to anyone that comes in the door. I think it's nice for us to look at this and go, we can build the connections with other deaf and hard of hearing service providers. So again, it's being supportive of those services to DV survivors. Another interesting topic is this. So this researcher who wrote this article recognized and noticed that of those 12 who provide services for IPV domestic violence services, talking about contacting police and courts and the legal system, not much of that's occurring. Most of those connections to police are providing interpreting services, meaning that many deaf clients are incarcerated or are perps as well. Or maybe they're survivors who inadvertently were arrested. And many times our agencies or people who provide those services are working so hard in regards to access and accessibility issues. Getting the interpreter, fighting for access. Again, those who are deaf, those who are hearing, look for interpreters. Maybe the deaf people become CDIs or DIs doing that work. Again, time is spent focused on not on domestic violence IPV support services and counseling and children connections and housing and and the like. The highest priority is accessibility of interpreting services. What's the impact on our community? If so, that's such a high rate of IPV and DV, and they're not receiving those services because the highest priority is just getting the interpreter. That's the hardest part, the interpreter. Interesting. I think it's also interesting that many agencies and service providers don't have a relationship with the judicial system or a lawyer or law enforcement. Why is that? I have theories and thoughts on this, but the research does not answer this question. My thoughts on this, and you can obviously discuss or think amongst yourselves. Maybe we're not comfortable with the police because there's communication and language access issues. Many communities of color are not comfortable with police officers because of racism or oppression. Again, deaf people have language access issues. Again, there's a separation that occurs with police. There's not working with them, and maybe that's minimized. What do you think? The same goes with the legal system. Legal aid and the court system. Why do many of us not feel connected? Is it because there's no interpreter access? Again, I'm just wondering on that. Our community strongly is connected to community-based resources, providing services to each other and resources to supporting each other and not using mainstream legal services. It's interesting. From my experience with Deaf Hope, that's very true. I recognize that as being very true. So I want to put up a chat box here. Hold on one second. Oh, sorry about that. Maybe there's a better way of doing this, but I'm not very skilled with technology. And it's getting darker and darker here. Okay, moving on. I took this from an article I read, and it's a figure in the article. But you can see this interesting piece comparing IPV of hearing providers, talking about IPV issues, and other issues are referred out. Okay, they focus on IPV. And oftentimes in my experience, there's a strict screening process. Again, with shelters, they're very strict on their screening process. Again, it's IPV. When that comes up, we'll provide services for IPV, and that's it. Again, with IPV of deaf service providers is very, very different. And it can help all, again, it's helping all deaf people, supporting. It's also discussing other issues of funding, housing, academic issues, translating paperwork. That's nothing to do with IPV, but it's that the whole life of the person. And so deaf IPV providers are doing so much of the work of many, many hats. You have to become an expert in many areas. So I'm just wondering, what's the impact of that on our field, on our community? Is this true for your agency? Okay, the next section here, I'd like to look at studies related to IPV. Those studies have been related to service providers, our services, our agency. Now, the next section here is IPV specifically. So I'm sorry, my eyes are diverted here because it's getting darker out here now with the eclipse. It's very, very cool. Okay. Okay, this study asked the question, is it abuse? Deaf female undergraduates labeling of partner violence. And so the poll, again, was at 97 deaf women, undergrads at Gallaudet University. And you'll notice, and I've noticed as well, not just to the deaf community, but which I think is the highest percentage. I don't have the stat in front of me right now. I don't want to give you the wrong statistic. But a high percentage of psychological related studies are always done at college campuses and students because it's easy. Where they work at the university, they study there, they ask the students at the university. A high percentage of psychological studies in general and findings are actually from college students themselves. Do they connect back to all people? Are college students' experiences as general population? No, they're not. You're a very small group of experiences, but again, that's typically applied in general. And just, again, that study here is that 97 deaf women undergrads at Gallaudet University. Again, almost 50% were white, and with other races also. 73% identify as straight, so it's white straight women are the highest percentage of this population group. The question was done in English, in writing. It's talking about your partner. Are they aggressive? Do they attack? Do they force sex? Do they negotiate for it? How do they use these terms when having a conflict? So let's move on to the results of the survey. So with that population group, 87.5% said they had experienced psychological aggression. Interesting, because the partner used emotional or mental abuse. 39.64% said they had experienced physical assault from a partner, and 19.6% reported injury. 56% experienced sexual coercion, rape, or suffering. Now, note that with all of these numbers, with 50%, you got 87%, you've got the 40%, and then you've got your 60%. But it's all pretty high, but 50% did not label this as an experience as abuse. That these items that we just discussed were not abuse. That is an interesting comment, stating that that's the underreported, underdocumented. And that's one reason that could be. People are not identifying abuse. They think it's normal, or they blame themselves, thinking it's my fault. And if I have experienced rape or sexual assault or injury or accusations, mental, physical, etc., I may not get help. I may not go to a DV agency because I don't think abuse has occurred, meaning they never get services, meaning that education is important, right? Services are available, education, which comes first? Really, they both are so important. 20% were hurt their partner, and some people don't consider that abuse. Now, there's another study here. Research can be a little bit dry, so let me try to kind of keep it lively and going here. But domestic violence and social support in a clinical sample of deaf and hard of hearing women. What this means is clinical, meaning people who received mental health services. That would be the clinical, that's what that means. So there's 46 deaf adults, women, that not a hospital inpatient, but maybe going to a center to receive mental health services. There's 2 questionnaires that went out. One was regarding conflict, one's about social supports. Do you have supports or not? 46 women, 71% of those 46 had emotional, psychological abuse. 57% said they experienced physical abuse from a partner. That's a very high number. It parallels with our previous study. Let's pull that back up. So look at the previous one, states that the college students was at 40%, had physical assault. And then looking ahead, this is 57%. And 87% had psychological. And then 71% said yes, they experienced psychological abuse. So you can see the numbers are different in different categories, different groups. You had students, college students, and then you had mental health services population group. But again, above 50%. So I feel if that this and then this, if there's more studies going on, you would think there may be a similar pattern and rate. In our own professional experience, we've seen this as well, so we know this is a very serious problem in our community. We can use this information to ask for funding, to ask for support from our community, discussing this with other deaf service providers. That's why it's so important they get trained in regards to IPV, DV, various abuses. It's so important that this information can reinforce and support our work. Stating that many did report the experience of domestic violence because saying I am deaf is why it's occurring. What more is not stated. But I know that Deaf Hope gives a power control wheel presentation that's often situational examples with being deaf. If you'd like to see it, you can see the Deaf Hope website for that information. But for this study, I'm not sure what was used. Any questions up to this point in regards to this? I just want to check in on our chat messages. Give me 1 second. Yes, Amber just mentioned that it's very difficult to know what resources are for all counties. What's available in each county? Every county differs. For hearing providers, they typically are in their one county. In regards to their court systems and legal processes, where we're deaf people, we're serving so many different counties with so many different people, and that impacts our work. Okay, now, before we proceed, I'd like to go ahead and take a 5-minute break at this time. Okay, let's take five. Go ahead and get a drink of water, use the restroom if you need to. Let's come back in 5 minutes, and I'll start moving forward at that point. So now it is 2:58. So let's return before 3:05. So okay, this is Pacific Standard Time. Actually, that would be Pacific time would be. I'm really bad with the timing. um, 12. So I'm 3 o'clock, so be back by 05. 5 minutes after, okay? Fair enough? We'll start at 05. All right. Oh, one more thing. We'll have a question about the college students. Yes, I'd love to discuss that further. So let's hold that, and then if you'd like to, go ahead and type in some questions for you, and I can answer those after our break. Okay? Thanks. We'll see you in a few minutes. Okay. Ugh. Yes. Me too. We got a few more minutes left. So good. Yes, I'm watching the eclipse. I saw a little bit of it. My kids and my children, my husband, we have a family pinhole. We made a box with a pinhole in it and put a piece of paper down so we can see that. So I was watching it using this pinhole box and watching it happen. It's very, very cool. Okay. Ew. Okay. I think that's clear. All right. Making sure everyone is back. Everyone's returning. Yep. We'll share the PowerPoint with you all. Absolutely. Yes, with the PowerPoint and the recording as well. So if you wanted to watch this once again, or someone else that wasn't able to attend and want to watch this, they sure can on the Deaf Action website. I believe it'll be distributed via email as well. So I want to check and make sure everyone is back. All right, great. It looks like back, everyone's back. Okay, let's do this. I'm going to go and proceed. I Googled. I just was explaining that idea of the psychological research, higher percentages from college students. I Googled that information and got an answer, quote unquote, an answer, based on one particular research potentially. But anyways, wondering, Holly, question. Maybe we can ask that question now. I'll hold off for Holly. Hey, Holly, do you want to type your question in? While we're waiting here, I'll go ahead and tell you this information I found, this article. It's called Psychology is Weird. Let me pull it up here. What it states is a big issue. Oh, so Holly just was wondering if using college students is research. Is that an appropriate use for collecting data regarding domestic violence, sexual violence? Well, I think that is a question we all can ponder and look into. If studies are about college students for college students, yeah. Like, for example, if we're saying, here, I'd like to discuss DVSA at Gallaudet University or DVSA in a college setting with a college population, it makes sense to use college students. Now, if I wanted to do a study on DVSV generally all over the country, would I use just college students? That is a great question. I don't agree with that. It's dangerous. I'd like to collect data from college students and apply that to all. That's dangerous. That's a problem with psychology and psychological research. This article states that there's a problem facing many social studies, sociology research, psychological research, and most percentages are education, Western, U.S. Let me try to pull up this list here. I'm sorry, hold on. Okay, it states that 67% of Americans, psychological study uses college students. What means that many of us, there's so many studies and researches based on college students' responses. And using this information, we're applying it to all people. That we have to be careful here. Again, that's where I stated you got to be careful with statistics, because oftentimes that statistic says this is the answer. Well, who did it? Is it a man? Is it a woman? Are they young? Are they old? Are they a college student? Are they rural? Are they urban? There's so many things that affect how we think, how we feel, how we behave. Our race, our gender identification, our sexual identification, disability. There's so much that's included. And so if we did a study that focused on a few people that are all in the same group, you can't apply that to all people. You can't. However, if you want to do a study, let's say we're studying white women, and I apply that to white women, that might be more apropos in that group. You might have more application, and that's the same is true with college students. Again, be careful. Many, many research studies and dissertations are done on college students because it's easy. Admittedly, it's easier. Does that benefit our community? Let's discuss that later on. There's something to keep in the back of your mind here. What does our community need from research? So 67%, that's one article stating 67%. I know another thing. Again, I'm a statistician. I love it. But research, I took a research methods class. The professor was talking about this in many medical studies, like for cancer drugs or for heart attacks and all the like. The majority of those studies are on white men. So many medications and prescription developments are not designed, but tested, I should say, mostly on white males. So later on, you find some interesting stats where women didn't have the same response, or heart attack symptoms. Women and men, we've noticed, are slightly different responses and symptoms. But historically speaking, it's always been studying white men. So there are some drugs that do work differently based on a variety of factors, where you live, what you eat, etc. But studies and research is typically based on a very small group of people. And typically it's white men. So now science is starting to stop and make some changes to their approach in doing medical studies and research, making sure to be more inclusive and more diverse before getting, to approve that for everyone. Because people didn't think that way. It's like, okay, let's just do it this way. But now that this medication is used for everybody, I think that's an issue with research. Has research in general. Okay, let's go ahead and proceed. Well, first of all, any other questions or thoughts or comments, curious questions, anything? Nothing? Well, let's proceed. The next study. This is DVSA. We typically use the word sexual violence because that's inclusive of a more broad group. There's a whole different sorts of, sexual related injuries, rape, molestation, the list goes on. Sexual assault is more, it's research based. So I put both in here. So let me be patient here. I have to check the chat box, make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay. All right. Now, this particular study, again, look who it's for, or who it's under. It's undergrads at Gallaudet, deaf females. So that's one issue with the research here. But as I give you this information, I'm emphasizing here, I'm being selective for some of the research. There's more research out there. Some of it's older, but I'm selecting more recent research pieces with different topics with IPV, service providers, SA, and next we'll do child abuse. But again, it's the research strongly based on college students, okay? Oh, also, didn't mention this, but many of them are questionnaires, okay? Many of these are questionnaires, so most of the time it's done in English on paper, meaning that is it accessible to many deaf people? Well, college students, maybe, but still not 100% accessible if it's ASL is their first language. And then if you use the US-based audience and do a questionnaire on paper, is that accessible? Not really. You're losing thoughts, you're losing people. You don't have the accurate information. But again, let's back up. For this particular study, 70 deaf women, undergrads, 69% did experience sexual assault in their lifetime. 96% from a man, 67% from a deaf person. So who mostly experiences this? From a male who is deaf. So it makes sense because, within the community, we know that statistics and research from many other minority communities, rape or sexual assault is usually done within the community, typically within the same community. Okay, it says in here 44% were assailants of friends. 29% were romantic partners. That matches up with what other research and discussions and statistics have shown with trainings and workshops I have similar numbers. That matches up. I want to go back for a second here. So 69% experienced this. This questionnaire asked the question, have you experienced someone forcing you to have sex? Have you experienced this? It's a question format, okay? So this would match the descriptions of sexual assault. Now, was this experience rape? 43% said no, it's not. What does this mean? Well, it's very similar to the previous studies we looked at. psychological abuse, physical abuse, pain and actually harm, but I don't call it abuse. Now look at this one. I experienced someone taking advantage of me sexually without my permission, penetration without my permission, etc. I don't call that rape. Why? Well, society might look down on me. There's a stigma attached potentially. I don't know that this is rape. I watch television. I visualize or think what rape is from a stranger. It can't be my partner raping me. There's so many reasons here. I work in the field and I've seen this, and I know you have as well. You that work in the field, you can give so many different reasons why this is the case. Some people will say this is research based only, and they don't know why. But this is why that I always feel it's important we connect the dots. There's the researcher that's not in the field at all, and there's those of us who work in the field every single day. Let's make that connection to tell the story of how this connect. It's such a common belief, I believe. Not just deaf. I know hearing people why. There's research that shows very similar statistics that they don't identify sexual assault or any sort of forced touching or even penetration as being not rape. I was not raped. Rape is a very strong stigma attached to it. Any questions about this particular study? Okay, again, I only have 15 minutes left, so what I'd like to do is I may go a little late, but I want to have a further discussion on this. This is why I didn't want to share, all the research studies. I wanted to really be selective here, so if you want to know more, contact me. I'm happy to give you more information, more studies, more stats, and obviously something to think about. Do we want to take more action on research or less action? Who should do it? That is something that's very important. What do we do going forward, I guess, is a bigger question. Again, there's one more study I want to share, then we'll have a discussion to wrap this up, okay? So, this one here is interesting. Again, college students, this is at RIT and TID, a much larger number, over 300 in this particular study, asking about their experiences of childhood trauma, maltreatment. What is maltreatment? It means being wronged or it's not appropriate, childhood, something related to childhood, and also PTSD in adults, symptoms of PTSD, okay? So, they asked both deaf and hearing. I'm wondering, I think my first line is incorrect. It's deaf and hearing. No, hold on. I'm sorry. I was looking at the wrong side. 147 hard of hearing, 317 hearing. 147 deaf and hard of hearing, 317 hearing college students. So, higher percentage, 76% here, experienced childhood, and 49% experienced both. They're pretty high. Both groups experienced childhood maltreatment and later on may have a victim again, be re-victimized. Deaf and hard of hearing people have an increased number of repetitive injuries, more trauma, more stress, and more PTSD symptoms compared to those hearing counterparts. How does that impact our work? Maybe we work with deaf and hard of hearing community members and their experience is repetitive. So it greatly increases their trauma and increases their symptoms and their needs for services. And that connects back with the other side. Many service providers are not specialized in abuse or trauma. Interesting. I can see a gap here. There's a gap. Okay, so I do have one more study, to discuss. One more to study. Now, this one's a new approach to research, and I was really interested in seeing this. Because up to this point, historically speaking, research has been unfortunate in many groups, has been shunning those who are oppressed, disability groups, deaf and hard of hearing groups, black African Americans, just separating out different groups that didn't fit their traditional U.S. white male, wealthy, college-educated sort of group. All these other people were typically hurt by research. This is historical. It's another completely different presentation we can give. I did think about this, actually. I just was with what happened in Charlottesville is this recent occurrence with so many people who went ahead and supported the Nazis' belief and the ideology and white supremacy. This group, this Nazi, has a history with research. They use many people for science, It's a horrible, awful, horrible research. If you want to look into it, you can. You can look it up online. There's documentation on this where they typically would use people who are disabled or Jewish people or gypsies and the like to do scientific medical experiments on them. And the deaf community is aware of this. Historically speaking, this medical research on deaf people has happened, trying to hear, if you will, and it's caused a lot of pain in the deaf community. In the Black and African American communities, there's a very famous study called the Tuskegee study, and it is a syphilis STD disease. And they went ahead and did this research for 40 years on black men who had this STD without explaining, and no consent forms, no medical treatment, nothing. There was nothing given to these people. Just come in for checkups, and behind it all was doing research on them, learning how this illness and disease progresses without their permission, consent, or agreement. Down the road, we found this out and said, oh, I'm so sorry. There was a lot of things happening, but a lot of stringent things happening because of that experience. But people suffered. People suffered for science and research purposes. So, looking back on science and research, it is seriously something validated, or is it not validated? Is it beneficial or harmful? There are some, but not all, that are focused to what's called a community-based research. What it basically means is that researchers partner with communities and community members, and they do the research themselves on their own community. The questions are not determined by the researchers, it's by the community members. What's important to us? What do we want? And the researcher's job is to assist in developing, planning, implementing, and how to draft and do the research and supporting them with the various resources. And in lieu, they get the information as well from the community. So it's trying to look more as an equal exchange and not an imbalance, not something of taken advantage of, but the researcher becomes successful, and their name is glowing because of this, but the community members get potentially nothing. But this is the idea, is it's more equitable, and it provides that to them. So I think it's more ethical for me as well, becoming more supportive. Now, Deaf Hope, last year, I believe, if you can tell me about that, I can't remember, but I think it was last year, maybe 2 years ago, we started the idea of consenting and participating with one particular project using this approach. And this culminated, I can show you the final results of that and what that looked like. Let me look at our time though. Hold on one second. Okay, I've got about 10 minutes left, so let me just quickly get into this. So I'd like you to take a look at the screen here in a second. One moment. Okay. With other organizations, I think it may have been 4 or 5 or more organizations, I believe. All of them were from what's called the marginalized, underserved, from an IPV DVSA perspective, community-based services. Some of them were Native groups, Latino groups, Latinx groups, Spanish speakers. I want to say there's a transgender group. Again, there's a lot of groups in the Bay Area that were grouped, and Deaf Hope was one of them. The idea is to do our own research and saying, do anything you want, whatever project you want. What's important is what they wanted us to do is share back with them. And so what we did is we started this process. We started with 8 people, survivors, 8 survivors, 1 man and 7 women. And you can see here, while Aracelia, who's presenting these results, again, I'm here in DC, but Aracelia has one person that was brought on board to draw this drawing, an overall perspective of what this looks like. I think this is really cool illustration explaining our experiences through this process, who's doing the research, why it's done, where it's coming from, where it's funded, is it back to the community? Because that open, we were very resistant to it, and now we think it might be important to get information from the community members. So research is key. We want to become better organized, improve our services. So we said, okay, we did it all in ASL. It wasn't in written English. The interview process was in ASL. Received their stories, and we had to take that to English, and how was that done to share it with the hearing community. So we became our own, it became our words, which is very much a big challenge for us as we looked into this. We have our own biases, and then we shared that out with the community. What did we learn? It's important that we partnered with that research community and our own community. The experience was very well worth it. And it was really worth it. And we got these great stories. We collected this information, and it was great. But you have to have community involvement. What we found is when we asked a question, not about DVSA situations at all. We asked that after the occurrence, if you will. So we said, who do you go to for support? Where did you go? Who'd you go to? And then we said, was the experience positive or negative? So what we found is the positive experiences were friends. They felt validated. They had access to information. Most positive experiences were with friends. Negatives were police, law enforcement. No communication, fear, not sure what was going on. That's a negative. And cultural sensitivities, were not there. So again, this is an overall picture. We're hoping to present this research down the road someday, I hope. We'll see. We'll have to discuss that with Arcelia. But again, our experience was that it was a lot of work to do. A lot of work and a lot of time. But again, as look at these participants, they're very willing to open their life story to us, and we thank them for that. And the idea is we took this research, we didn't just leave. We try to continue to provide the services, support, advocacy, and maybe think that traditional research approaches may re-traumatize, re-victimize so many survivors of IPV DVSA. Okay, so let's start wrapping this up here. I've thrown out so much pieces here, but I want to give you a sample to touch on different pieces. What do we do with this information? What can you do with this information? And that question is really for you to ponder. My thought is there's two things. First of all, there are numbers and stats are powerful for many people, especially funders. We want money, we have to validate our worth. I'm not crazy about that part of it, I'm really not, but it's true. And then there's a high percentage of occurrences in our communities. Underserved, not enough information, not sufficient services, not specialized in IPV, DV, SA. There's not enough of that. That information is there. If we had enough pieces and studies, we might be able to make a stronger proposal that we need additional supports. That can be done, from our funders and from our community as well. Also, I think it's important to note here that many studies are the same group, white, females, college students. What about the rest of the group? What about the rest of the community that's out there? It's a diverse community. Who is asking those questions to them about their experiences? How do we do that? Is it English? Is it better in ASL? That's my thought about my future as well. If I get into research, what am I going to do with this? How do I do it? What does it look like? Interesting. It's easier just to, here's a piece of paper, distribute it, date it back, thank you so much, put it back together again, and I'm done. It's much easier, but is it the right thing to do? Anyways, think about what your work looks like, your organizations, and trying to collect data. Do you want to share that data? Keep it internal. Again, that's part of research as well. Another thing I'd like to, I've been thinking about as well as we move forward here. We look at this scale I've got a picture of here. You've got research benefits, and I'll just talk about the benefits there, and what is the potential harm or the community member harm. So now there's more and more research connected with trauma, IDV, sexual violence, etc. It's important to provide services and counseling and support right after they tell their story. Don't ask people to tell their story. Say, thanks so much, I'm leaving. No. You have to provide the supports. My argument was, okay, deaf survivors. Do we have enough people to support them in their language? Because many places don't even have deaf DVSA services. Many places do not have deaf or signing counselors. How can we better capitalize in community information if we don't have enough service providers to provide the services? That's a balancing point. We have to get the information, then we can develop services. So I think it's important we always are thinking of that balance, that tip. And we as organizations are thinking about where's your worth, investing in resources and research. Maybe it's not for your community. Maybe your community, you have to look at that as well. So, a little bit of time left here. Final thoughts. I know that we've got a little bit here. I rushed through the end to wrap up the presentation, but final thoughts. Do you feel that your organizations, do they do any sort of research? Have you participated in research? Have you experienced it yourself? How about internally? How do you collect data internally? I'm sure you have to collect something for grant reporting. Do you use this data? I'm wondering. Let's see if I can't see a response. Again, if you don't want to answer now, not a big deal. Don't worry about it. But for Deaf Hope, we typically did not use a lot of statistics and percentages. We didn't do that. The sign for abuse can affect an answer as well. So this is interesting. So if I asked a question to you, I said, hey, have you experienced abuse? And I said it like this. No, never. But there's different kinds of ways to ask what the word abuse. Do you spell it out? Does everyone understand the word abuse? It's a challenge. I think it's critical to provide access in ASL, but how do you make sure that ASL is accessible to everyone in the deaf community? That's not an easy one to answer. Araceli is saying deaf agencies doing research, intake, collecting information from survivors. Okay. Abuse. Does that affect the answer? And Araceli, I asked her and asked the POC, how do you make the POC not feel tokenized because I'm the POC? How do you do that? How do you provide a community approach? Honest and ethical, I agree. I think it has to come from the community. Any type of services, research, collecting of data, information, I expect them to share their feelings, their thoughts, their stories, their experiences. But you can't just say, give me the story. You have to provide validation that we value and care that in that relationship. Those of us who work in this field know. They know this. I think we have this in us. But when you look at a research world, they're still learning as they go. They think of numbers. I need to get my numbers. I need to get my stats. Get these 50% of deaf people experience DV. There's people behind those. Those aren't just numbers. There's actual people with experiences. 50%, one person is critical. One person is enough. And to say that's wrong, I have to wait until, I don't have to wait till I get to 100 people for that. So that's an important thing to look at. Our work will never end. Never. So I think I'm done with my presentation. The PowerPoint will be shared with all of you. If you have any more questions or anything else about statistics information, please email me or Deaf Action TA. I'm happy to respond. It'll be forwarded to me and I'll respond anytime. Now next week, I do look forward to the exact same time as this one. Next Monday at 11 West Pacific time, 2 Eastern. We'll have a discussion where everyone will be on camera so we can all set your webcams up so we have a deep discussion about this, really unpacking it all, okay? All right, well that is my, again, my research world I'm living in now, but I really hope and want to connect research, academia, and connect it back to the community work. I want to make that connection, make that experience connect, and make it more inclusive of all people, deaf hard of hearing, deaf blind, deaf with other disabilities, etc., hard of hearing. I believe that's key, and that will help us as a community as well. Okay, thank you all so very much for your watching me and your time tonight. I appreciate it. All right, I'm done. Thanks. Bye-bye. I'm going to turn my camera off now, everybody.